European politics have been very interesting, to say the least, over the last few years. And I have the pleasure of being here today in Halifax at our Conservative Party convention with somebody who I really respect and who I've gotten to know, and his name is Dan Hannan. And he is a very prominent member of the European Parliament, and he's also the head of essentially what constitutes a major Conservative party within the European Parliament. And Dan has done a lot of work to unify the Conservative movement, actually around the world through your organization, and is uniquely focused on politics in the very interesting context of the European Parliament. So I'm really excited.
What a
that
fabulous
you're here
intro,
today.
Michelle. I mean, let's just quit while we're ahead there. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
No, but you know, you've done some really interesting work. You're going to be speaking at our convention tonight.
I am.
You've been invited. I think that's anybody who's here is lucky. But for a Canadian audience who, you know, is perhaps not attuned to European politics and etc., but it's so important for us to be, because the European Union could be a major trading partner for us. Brexit, you know, we have a lot of opportunities with the EU. Maybe do you want to start with talking about how you think Canada is perceived right now, given our current government?
Well, thank you. I should begin. Well, actually, I should begin by saying I suddenly realised what a faux pas I've committed. Here I am in Justin Trudeau's Canada, and I'm wearing a suit, and I've made no effort to parody the Indigenous costume of local people. So let me immediately try and win favour with the locals by dressing in the way everyone else does and fitting in.
I feel much more comfortable. Thank you.
You know, I think Brexit is going to bring opportunities, right?
Okay.
Like, with anything that's worth doing, there's always some transitional disruption. You know, you move house from a pokey little flat to a big one. However much nicer the new house is, the move is still going to be stressful, right? But we will emerge from this process not only a more democratic country, but I think a more globally engaged and economically liberal country. And one of the opportunities that we will have very early is to go beyond the positive but limited trade deal that Canada has with the EU, the CETA deal, and liberalise much further.
Okay.
And what I'd really like to do is to have a trade deal with Canada based on complete mutual recognition, based on the simple principle that whatever is legal in your country is automatically legal in ours, and vice versa, that applies to services, it applies to professional qualifications. In other words, we trust each other's regulators. There's a handful of countries in the world where you have enough interoperability, if you like, that you can do that. But I think Canada and the UK are definitely in that category.
So what would that mean for somebody who's sitting at home who says, oh, trade deals, I just, you know, how does that relationship, what is that going to mean for our two countries?
Yeah, I mean, the trouble with a lot of existing trade deals is that corporations use them to raise barriers to entry.
Okay.
And they do it by saying we need common environmental standards or labour laws or whatever. I mean, of course, it's never really about that. It's always about keeping out the competition. But imagine a trade deal that just says you can pick either a UK or a Canadian standard for anything. For manufactured goods, for services, for employment contracts, for, you know, if you're qualified to practice as a salesman in financial services or an insurance broker, you can automatically work in the other country. Then you really get prices falling, more opportunities, and then you have a trade deal that is really for the consumer rather than just for business.
That's so in terms of our ability as a country to negotiate an agreement such as that, do you get the sense that there's a lot of confidence in the current government in terms of their ability to do that? Maybe that's a loaded question.
You know, I mean, look,
you know, because you're another legislator from another country, but like, I will ask a different way.
I'm from another country, but you know, we're kind of a kindred country, right? So I'm going to presume on our long shared history together to
what do we need to do to get this done?
There was a tricky situation created by Donald Trump on NAFTA, right? That's not Justin Trudeau's fault. However, I don't think he's responded particularly wisely to this challenge. And there is a real danger that Canada is now being left out. I mean, as you and I are speaking here, the handshake deal is being scheduled between the US and Mexico.
Right.
It would have been, I think, much wiser to have just gone for a more liberal policy. But I don't think his heart was ever really in it. You saw that with the equivocal approach he took to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. By the way, that's something that we're going to be very keen on joining.
Great.
We want to be partners of yours in the TPP. And you may, viewers who say, well, Britain isn't a Pacific country, look really closely at a map. You see a tiny little pink spot, which is Pitcairn Island. So we do technically just about qualify as a Pacific economy. But, you know, let me, as I say, presume on the kindred friendship between our countries. When Justin Trudeau won the election, I was surprised. I didn't think he had any depth, but I thought, look, I'm a friend of Canada, a friend of Canadian democracy. I really hope this guy does well.
Sure.
You know, and I hope my
Sure.
doubts are misplaced. Every day that has passed, it becomes clearer that there is nothing there behind the smile and the good looks. You know, there's like the Cheshire Cat. There's only the smile. There's nobody behind it. And I can't think of a greater contrast in politics than that between the two leaders of the big Canadian parties. On the one hand, a guy born with every opportunity, who turned out to be completely insubstantial. Mm-hmm. You know, the kind of supply teacher accidentally elevated. And then on the other, somebody born in a very ordinary background, but who has extraordinary qualities of resilience and character and commitment. And if there's any justice in the world, I think voters will recognize that.
So, obviously immigration policy is something that's very hot in Canada, and it is around the world. You've been very active in this debate, sort of tangentially and directly. What are some of the learnings that you've had as being part of the European Parliament and subsequently dealing with Brexit and some of the dynamics there in terms of Canada? Are there pitfalls to avoid? Are there opportunities in terms of learning or best practice that you think we should be looking at?
The first point to make is that people can legitimately have concerns about the levels of immigration without being bad people. Right? And this is something that needs constantly to be stressed. There are reasonable concerns to be raised about pressure on infrastructure, pressure on housing and so on, pressure on wages, which don't make you a racist or a bad person. Conversely, I think the concern that most people have is not that they hate all immigration, it's that they want to feel that they are in control of roughly who is coming in and roughly in what numbers. Now, when you're in the EU, you, by definition, don't have any control of those things because you have free movement for 500 million people. But if people do sense that they're ultimately in charge, then I think it's possible to win an argument for a reasonable level of legal primary immigration. I think the last Tory, the government that you were part of here, did a really good job. It became very difficult to enter this country illicitly. But there was a path to naturalization and citizenship for people who played by the rules and did the right thing. And I think one of the consequences of people coming here legally is that they arrived with a sense of achievement, you know, and they arrived with a sense of patriotism, to use an unfashionable word. Right? I just think of what it means when you leave behind family, friends, language, and cross half the world. You don't do that to come to a country that you think's a bit crap, right? You should be starting with people who have all the positive, optimistic attitudes that you want. And I think that Canadian immigration policy has been hugely more successful than most European immigration policy, precisely because it's been based on legality and control. Whereas in Europe, what we see, everyone has seen it on their TV screens around the world, is mass movements of people which are uncontrolled and beyond the power of the authorities to do anything about.
So Canada and the United States have an agreement, it's called the Safe Third Country Agreement, by which we essentially say if you've reached one of our countries, you shouldn't be able to claim asylum in the other.
Right.
So that you're not gumming up the system, we're recognizing mutually strong asylum systems. My understanding is that there's been some work in Europe on what essentially would be a European-wide safe third country.
There is such a deal in Europe in theory.
Right.
There is such a deal in theory. It's called the Dublin Convention. You are supposed to make your asylum claim in the first safe country you reach, and that covers all EU states. Of course, in practice, that has plainly not been happening, right? You look at which country has been receiving the highest number of asylum claims per capita, Sweden, right? To put this as neutrally as possible, you have to pass through a number of other safe countries on the way to Sweden. And what's been happening is that this disincentivizes authorities from checking people's papers because they know that they're on their way somewhere else. So we've had large numbers of illegal migrants, of sans-papiers, into Spain, Italy, Greece. the authorities there don't make any effort to take their fingerprints to find out who they are, because they know that if they do that, they will become the responsibility of that country. So it becomes much easier to wave them through to France or Austria, which then waves them through to Germany, which then waves them through to Sweden. And this has been the problem. Now, contrast somebody who comes to Canada legally and, you know, with goodwill and with all the bright, optimistic dreams that drags people across the ocean, with somebody who's entered that way. You know, what does that teach you about the country that you've come to? You've arrived learning contempt for the state and for its authority. You know, and that's a very, very bad starting point.
One of the things that we've been talking about in Canada that's been a very hot debate is the whole topic of humanitarian immigration, right? And I think that, you know, I spent some time obviously with you earlier this year, and I saw that in the European Parliament too, is that you had, it was almost like this sole focus on, okay, well, everyone's a humanitarian immigrant, therefore,
yep.
Do you think that there is a place to talk about the fact that countries like ours have always had an obligation, have always resettled the world's most vulnerable, but at the same time talk about the fact that there are people who abuse our asylum system?
You've got to have some system of control, right?
Yes.
You can't. Humanitarian is a very broad word,
right?
Legally, a refugee is somebody fleeing from persecution or oppression. It is not somebody fleeing from corruption or poverty. And if it is, then the whole world pretty much could move to Canada or to Britain. 3 years ago, I actually spent the summer volunteering in a hostel for underage asylum seekers and migrants in Italy. It was the height of the Mediterranean boat people crisis. And I was there with brave, resourceful, ambitious kids who were doing what I suspect you or I would have done in their situation. They were mainly West African. You know, they were guilty of nothing more than wanting a better life, but they were in almost every case not refugees, not as we define that word legally. Now, if we are prepared to open our doors to anyone who is coming from a worse country, then potentially there are billions of people who'd have the right to do it, and there is a practical limit. And so we need to have a system that sorts out who can come in and with what kind of order of priority. And it's going to be, you know, wherever you draw the line, it's going to be pretty unfair to the person who's just on the wrong side of that line. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a line at all. And it certainly doesn't mean that you do what Europe is currently doing, which is effectively to contract out its immigration policy to the people smugglers. So the way you are guaranteed entry into Europe now is not by having the best humanitarian claim, nor by filling in the forms in the correct way. It's simply by being able to jump the queue by paying one of these people in Libya or whatever to take you across the Mediterranean illegally. And I just don't see how anyone, left or right, can defend that system. So,
look, you have lived through this debate, and I think you've done remarkably well, and many of your colleagues have. And I think what we're trying to find in Canada is that ability to have the discussion about how, right? Like you said, I loved what you said, under what circumstances and in what order of priority. And that's not a fashionable discussion to have.
No, because it doesn't permit you to do the virtue signaling of, oh, well, I'm a human being and everyone should be able to come here. But practically that is impossible. You know, and this is why the issue is too important to be left to the left. You need to be unsentimental about it. And, you know, you guys in office, I think, did a pretty good job. I think we did a pretty good job relatively in terms of controlling illegal migration, bringing down bogus claims. But the trouble is that if you start from the position that, you know, we shouldn't be living in these privileged countries and we owe a huge debt to the rest of the world and they're somehow poor because of it's all our fault and so on, then you're really not coming at this debate with the right approach, and you're bound to make mistakes.
So you are here in Canada. You are gracing us with your presence at this convention.
Great to be here. It's always great to be here.
What are some of the key messages you want to leave everyone with?
You know, I would say two things. First of all, if Canadians are anything, they're fair-minded. And there is nothing fair and there is nothing ethical about running up incredible debts and passing them on to your kids, right? We all recognize that it would make you a bad parent if you did that in your family. It's no different if you do it nationwide or if you get a politician to do it on your behalf. And I think most Canadians recognize that. This government inherited from you guys, from the government in which you were a minister, a golden economic legacy. Budget surplus, falling taxes, strong economy, incredibly strong growth. And already they've blown away the surplus and they've exhausted the nation's credit. So that's point one. Point two, and I'm going to say something really because you know me, Michelle, I'm going to say something really, really unfashionable, but I think there is a proper place for the Canadian Conservatives to be a patriotic party. And what I mean by that is that, for me, Canada is much more than the kind of Trudeaupian vision that defines this country as being a touchy-feely, UN-compliant, nappy-changing, eco-conscious social democracy. Your friends overseas still remember the Canada of Vimy Ridge and the Canada of Juno Beach. And unless I've completely misread the temper of this country, I don't think Canadians have completely forgotten it either.
No.
There is an important role for a right-of-centre party, and particularly for the party of John A. Macdonald, to be the guardian of that inheritance, to try and pass on to the next generation that they're not just a random set of individuals born to another random set of individuals, but that they are heirs to an extraordinary tradition, and that part of the privilege of being a Canadian, wherever your parents were born, part of the privilege of being a Canadian is that you want to keep those freedoms intact and pass them on securely to the next generation.
Well, I'm looking forward to your speech.
Thank you.
And thank you for all the work that you do, and to your colleagues as well. And it's nice to see relationships from across the pond, as it is, impact our public policy here. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle.
Working hard for you in Halifax. Have a great day.